Welcome to this episode of Sustainably Wed's Head Table series. In this season, we are talking with experts about how to make the wedding industry more sustainable. And today we're going to be talking about sustainable wedding travel. If you are planning a wedding, you're hosting a wedding sometime soon, chances are someone is traveling for that wedding. Maybe it's family from across the country, maybe it's friends, or maybe you're traveling and it's a destination wedding. Chances are somebody is getting on a plane or they're getting on a bus. There's some travel associated with it. And that's what we're here to talk about today, because tourism and travel really contribute a lot to the actual footprint, the carbon footprint of your wedding. So how do we do that in a sustainable and ethical way? So to talk about that today, I have two incredible experts here. On my left here, we have Trina, who is the general manager of the Parkside Hotel. And I'm very happy that we are in the Parkside Hotel right now. It's an incredible venue, which is Biosphere certified. It's part of the Vancouver Island Green Business Association. It has many more designations that I cannot remember because there are so many. Trina, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to be here and to have this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah. And to my right here, we have Natasha. Natasha is not only the owner of Clearwater Events, a wedding planning company based in Vancouver, but is also the co-founder of The Good Green, which is an incredible resource for wedding vendors and event professionals to help them make more sustainable choices in their business. If you haven't checked it out already, definitely check it out. Really recommend it. There's a blog post on the Sustainably Wed series. Definitely check that one out. Natasha, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and the Songhees First Nations. And we are just so happy to be here at the Parkside talking about sustainable travel. Now there's an intro that plays. Probably. Okay, well, let's dive right in then. So before we talk about weddings in general, I want to talk about tourism and travel. And I've heard the word or the phrase regenerative tourism come up a lot. And I want to ask you, Trina, to start with, what is regenerative tourism and how is it different than how we might have traveled in the past?
Well, regenerative tourism, it's not a new idea, but it's new to like kind of tourism and to business models to be applying, and that is the idea that you're going to a place and leaving it better than the way you found it, right? So if you think of kind of like a flat line, vertical and horizontal with a center, the center is where you're sustainable, right? It means that you're having no impact, both negatively or positively, so you're sustainable. But we don't operate our world in a sustainable manner. We just don't. And we have to compensate for years of what we have consumed. And so that's where the idea of regenerative tourism is you're going further down that line where you're actually giving back. And giving back can be different for businesses in the tourism sector, how that looks like versus what a tourist or a visitor or a wedding guest might do to give back in a regenerative way.
Right. Awesome. Well, and here at the Parkside, you describe yourself as climate positive. So is that what you mean when you're saying climate positive rather than say like carbon neutral?
So yeah, we are beyond carbon neutral. So those are kind of like two kind of concepts I keep separate. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when you think about climate positive and carbon neutrality, so we were carbon neutrality in 2018, and we decided 2022, we decided, it's now 23, we decided in 2022 to go above and beyond. So we actually are investing more into carbon offsets than what our business generates in greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so that's where climate positive. There's different kind of terms people are using, carbon positive, right? Instead of climate positive. So there's kind of different terms that you can use. We went with, because the offsetting company we use, they use the term climate positive. So we wanted to keep consistent. To me, as a business model, regenerative tourism, it's not just being climate positive. There's more to it from a business perspective. So looking at running a circular economy, looking at really educating our guests in a meaningful way, right? And so we're working towards what I think is more regenerative tourism as a business model, but it's definitely more progressive. And then from a tourist perspective, people can offset their flights and they can be sustainable.
Yeah.
They can offset more and be, a bit more down that regenerative, or they could do that and, do more when they get to that community. And there's some really fun things going on that tourists can do that, permanently changes their behavior and how they travel.
Right, which is so cool. And I want to get into all those individual actions that we can do, not just as tourists, but as people, visiting a new place for the first time for a wedding,
Yes.
say. And I think that's such a cool opportunity for that. Before we do, you are also on the Sustainability Committee for Destination Greater Victoria.
That's correct, yes.
So is this a shift that you're seeing in the industry more broadly and not just at the Parkside?
Yeah, I mean, we've been at it here at the Parkside since 2009. So, this is kind of how we've rolled since the beginning, since we opened. And when I started talking to my peers about just sustainable tourism, in 2016, 2017, I was kind of looked at and who brought her to the table? But now we're really seeing this real dramatic shift. This the post-COVID, which I'm tired of saying, but it is this awakening that the industry's had, and it's really great to see.
Yeah, absolutely. As much negative came out of COVID, there have been some shifts, and particularly in this industry, which is maybe a good place to bring weddings into the conversation. Speaking of shifts due to COVID, let's talk about this from a wedding perspective. Maybe before COVID, from your experience as a wedding planner, how many guests would typically be traveling for a wedding? Let's say at an average wedding, how many would be coming in from out of town, and how would they get there?
It's a really tricky question. I think on average, let's say 100 guests at a wedding is easy numbers. I've done weddings where 90% are traveling in from out of town. That can be within the province, that can be within Canada, that can be internationally. I've seen weddings where nobody is flying and everyone's local, and that's just because all of their family and their community is local. I think here in British Columbia, as premier destinations, we see a lot more travel incoming with flights, but that's just because we live in this beautiful location.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the island here is definitely known as a wedding destination, and that's where, when you're in the wedding industry, you don't often think of yourself as being in the tourism industry, right? But certainly throughout COVID, it became very clear that not only are we part of that, we're tied to it, because people have to travel to get to these weddings here, even if it's just from Vancouver. And so there's travel happening because people want to be in this place. They want to share this experience with people, right?
I will say in terms of trends, I think what we're seeing in the shift post-COVID is now people really want to gather. So that sort of itch that people were seeing in 2021, 2022 as restrictions started to lift, we're still seeing the sort of after effects of that. And so folks that may have been, I don't know if our family can invest in that trip for once a year, we're now going to do it because we really want to see our people. And so I think travel has seen a big uptick as a result.
Right. So if you're a wedding couple, say, who knows that a bunch of their guests will be traveling for their wedding, how do you start having the conversation about traveling sustainably? Where does that happen, and at what point do you, is it on the invitations where you just say, make sure you choose a sustainable vendor for this or something like that, or how do you broach that with your guests and anybody who's invited? I'll start with you, Natasha.
Sure. I think as a wedding planner, I always recommend that my couples have a wedding website, regardless of if they're sending out paper invitations or not. it makes RSVP so much easier because it's gathered online, but it also acts as a source of truth and a really good place to direct guests for anything information related about your wedding. And always a big chunk of that are accommodations and travel. And we can get into this, but around what they do once they're in town. So how to make their community better than when they came here. And so part of that responsibility would really be on the couple, maybe a planner coming in saying, here are some like more sustainable properties that you could list instead, but typically they're a little bit pricier. So I always recommend also having a couple of different budget options.
A couple of different options. And I imagine at the Parkside you see that at a different point kind of in that wedding planning journey. But you mentioned that, the Parkside has an opportunity to educate people not only before they stay, but also when they're here. So are you able to connect guests with more regenerative experiences when they're here?
Yeah, so we do a number of weddings a year, and also have a number of what weddings we call like room blocks. So they might be having their venue somewhere else, but they need that accommodation. And so we have lots of tools that we use in our hand kind of bag. One of them is we have a series called the Trails series that we provide to people when they arrive, and they're all very thoughtfully and carefully sourced, each trail. So a trail might be a walking tour of Indigenous owned businesses downtown Victoria, right? Or an artisan trail of local artists and their businesses, a farm to plate restaurant trail. And then you got your craft brewery trails and your wine trails, which are all local businesses. And so, that's one tool that we use a lot, that people come to the desk and say, I'm looking for, our wedding's still a day or two away and we're looking for some things to do. Well, here's some fun things to go do. And so they're all very, very carefully thought out, each business, and we've approached each business to make sure that it's authentic when we're promoting it.
Sure. Yeah, you can kind of act as a curator in that. And that's such a good resource for couples to really lean on. But I think it touches on something else there as well, is that people are not just traveling for that one day, that one event. That might be the focus of their travel, but typically speaking, they're also going to be doing other things while they're in a place, including visiting local businesses and, going on local tours. And that speaks to another end of regenerative travel and tourism. I mean, we've been talking about it from like a footprint standpoint, but there are also social and economic impacts. And I wonder if you can kind of speak to how travel and certainly, regenerative or ethically minded travel can impact the local community.
Well, when you look at the tourism industry as a whole, I mean, it's really made up to small to medium-sized enterprises. We employ the most women worldwide. We have the most small businesses out of any industry. And so when you come into a destination, I mean, you're supporting the community at the local roots, right? You're supporting restaurants that are owned by families, right, who are buying supplies in their local community, right? You are supporting, the Robert Bateman Center, which is, an artist gallery here in town. And these are all locally owned businesses, and all on that small to medium size scale, right? So you're really investing from a social and economic standpoint back to these businesses, which again makes these communities more resilient to changes in the economy, makes it more resilient for supply chain, because if more things are sourced locally, there's less greenhouse gas emissions because less is being transported in. Right. So it has a huge positive effect that really does benefit the community. Absolutely.
Well, and resiliency is an interesting word there and kind of concept. And we were speaking about COVID earlier. I think a sustainable wedding community is also a resilient wedding community. And have you found that when you're working with, say, businesses through the Good Green, have you found that the ones that are more connected to their local community fared better through COVID?
I think so, and I also think COVID did wonders because I think it brought in that extra sense of community. It brought in that sense of connection because we were all sort of trying to survive, and so that brought in a natural sense of support, which I think has carried forward.
Right, absolutely. So we've talked about this a lot from a couple standpoint. Like, what can a couple do to help kind of direct their guests towards making these good choices? Where do businesses come into that conversation? Like, what can we do as vendors to help encourage wedding guests, wedding couples to make good travel and tourism choices? Do you have any ideas on that?
It's hard. The consumer isn't yet 100% at the point where they're looking first for sustainable or regenerative. They are still price sensitive. They are still looking at maybe the dream of what they have in mind, sure. Right? And so I'm a big kind of believer of what I call choice editing, behavioral science, and that is, as a business, is trying to shift their behaviors without them knowing it, right? And hopefully they'll take away that, like, oh, all right, that hotel had compost, and right, and why don't other hotels have compost? And maybe next time they travel, they're looking for a place that has similar things, right? That they're like, oh, that can be done, right? So that's kind of the way I look at that. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How about? You work with a lot of smaller businesses, entrepreneurs and wedding vendors who maybe exist part-time in this industry, but not full-time, and maybe don't have a lot of resources behind them. What's some of the low-hanging fruit that vendors might be able to grab onto to help direct couples towards sustainable travel choices?
That's $1 million question. I think a lot of it is around education. Yeah. So I think it's theme and a thread that we've been seeing throughout this series is the small actions still making an impact. So what you're doing, even though you think it might be pretty minuscule in the grand scheme of things, if we're all making those small changes, just think about that on a much grander scale. So for me, and encouraging other vendors, you might not have a ton of time to invest, or you might not have the resources to do that, but what you can do is these two things. Mm-hmm. And then again, we can build upon that later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah.
What about from a policy standpoint? Is there any room for provincial or local governments to play a role within this? And what might that look like kind of in partnership with venues like this?
Yes, there is room. Absolutely. To date, there hasn't been a lot of conversation. And I think it's because, honestly, I see business now moving a bit faster than government is and making change. Right. And so what we kind of saw through COVID was a lot of destination management organizations really pivoting and making big changes within their membership base and pushing out to their members. So Biosphere is one of the big ones that we've seen a huge change. Before COVID, I think there was maybe 30 cities around the world are Biosphere, and now it's just exploding, right? And here in BC, I believe almost all of the regional destination management organizations have signed up now to Biosphere. So that will mean that in the coming years, the whole BC province will be certified from a DMO standpoint. Wow. So, businesses are now kind of moving faster. Mm-hmm. Than government's moving. Yeah. So do we want to see government, though, come and have that conversation? Absolutely. Right. I think, like you said, with the wedding industry, is that we learned a lot through COVID, and that was that the tourism industry is part of the conference centers, is part of, it brings millions and millions of dollars into destinations, but because we're so fragmented, and you mentioned weddings don't see themselves as part of tourism. I see weddings as part of tourism because it's my market share, right?
Of course, yeah.
But restaurants might not see themselves as part of tourism, and so we're a very fragmented industry. So it's harder for us to come together to lobby government to say what we really need.
Absolutely,
right? So, as we get better at that, and I think with this collective voice that we're starting to develop with programs like Biosphere, it's going to be easier to go to government and have those conversations.
And for anybody who doesn't know, which includes me, what is Biosphere certification?
So Biosphere certification is a destination certification model, and it can also be a business certification model. It's based on the 17 sustainable goals, and it's a result of the Responsible Tourism Institute initiative that was taken many years ago. And so it's a criteria that is, in simple terms, funnels all back up to the World Tourism Organization for United Nations. And so it's like a declaration with the 17 goals, and it's got 400 indicators within it that you have to work towards and achieve. So it's not an easy accomplishment to get. But it's a great framework for businesses and for destination management organizations to work within to really bring all the stakeholders to the table.
Amazing. That's so cool. It doesn't surprise me that you also teach this at Royal Roads University within their hospitality management program. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, in case anybody did not know.
Many hats.
Yes, one of the many hats. Yeah. So when we're thinking about travel in the coming years, say 5-10 years, how do you think that travel and tourism in general might change?
Well, I mean, tourism and travel has been growing at double digits since pre-COVID. We can't keep up this pace. I mean, our labor, we just don't have the labor. But the market is growing, and you're not seeing any other sectors growing in the digits that tourism is. And that is because we have this huge emerging new markets, countries opening up that never used to travel, middle class developing in countries that never had middle class, more people, more births, a higher population base, right? And so we're growing in double digits. Right. So when you say to an owner group, we expect 13% increase in revenue, that could be true. Whereas most sectors and most businesses and industries would never think about double digits. But we also have 8% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. We're higher than some of the industries like construction.
Wow.
So when you start to think about that, you think like, wow, that's a big footprint. Yeah. Right? We're one of the largest employers in the world, right? And so how is it going to change? Well, we have to change because we can't keep up the way we are doing it. So we do have to move towards a new model, a regenerative model. And, that has to be the future because, tourism and weddings, we sell destinations, we sell beauty, landscape, sense of place. And if we don't have that, well, we don't have an industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Does 13% growth sound a little scary coming from a wedding planner who's very booked?
As a small business owner, that's both frightening and wonderful. Yes.
Yeah. It's good in both ways. And I agree that we cannot keep up doing things the way that we have been doing them for all of those reasons, and including the fact that in the wedding industry, at the very least, we don't have the staff, as you mentioned.
Nobody's got the staff.
No, and so that kind of growth is it's exciting, but it's also a little bit alarming. But a sense of place is something I wanted to touch on because that came up when I was reading about regenerative tourism. The protection of sense of place really came up quite a bit when I was reading. And that's, as you mentioned, it is a key selling factor when we are considering weddings, when we're considering events. When we want to bring people here to Victoria, say, sense of place is huge. But one of the things that I've seen in the wedding industry is venues that will open up here on the island and then they'll close down a year or two later, partly because the local community doesn't see that venue as an asset in their community. They see pollution, they see litter, they see increased traffic, and they don't see a lot of economic benefit. They don't see a lot of social benefit. So if we, as a wedding industry, try and shift towards a regenerative approach that benefits our community, do you think that will help us make those connections so that weddings are seen as an asset and something that communities want to have? Rather than what we might be seen as now, which is an occasional pest?
I think that, it boils down to educating the community, right? And many times you see community members who are maybe a little bit steadfast in their ways. It's because they've lived that way, maybe in that community, in that home for 20, 30 years, right? And they've got roots there, and they've got memories of how it is or how it should be. Yeah. And so starting to change that landscape and sense of place for them is very different, right? And so, you see that conversation happening a lot, right? And I think it boils down to education, open dialogue, that stakeholder engagement. And because it is hard on the community sometimes with events and, whether it be concerts or weddings, but, a large number of influx for a weekend and then a deflux, right? Yeah. So it can be hard. But I think through proper dialogue and the business model really trying to showcase itself in the right light, and taking that extra time, I think, slowly people's minds will change.
Yeah, well, and that speaks to doing business differently than what we've done before, because in some cases, weddings have been very transactional events where you go in, it's a day, you leave, and maybe you leave some big bags of garbage behind. And you can see how local communities would not like that.
I think, too, when we're going into very residential communities, folks always see the bad. So they see the litter, but they see the amount of noise that we're generating. We're there till 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, and then vendors are there making a whole bunch of noise till 3 in the morning. Of course, residents aren't going to like that because we just leave, we just drop a whole bunch of things and then we're out, right? So I think on our end, to your point, we have to build that sense of education. We need to really show the case studies and the why we're important to business and why we're important to the community, and then advocate a little bit for it too, and make it more of a collaborative effort. And
I think too, even working with people who have this vision of a wedding in mind, but shifting that vision a bit, like maybe daytime wedding is better. Yeah. Right? Because it's better suited for the community, right? So you start to have those conversations with them too, because they might have to make some compromises.
Right, yeah, our kind of conception of what an event should look like, maybe we need to change that, which again speaks to doing things differently than how we've done them before. Yeah. But that actually opens up a lot of doors. I'm sure you've seen some awesome weddings that do not fit the typical schedule or mold.
I love me a daytime wedding. Give me a Sunday brunch wedding and I'm home by 10 o'clock. Yes, please. I will take those all day long.
Every wedding vendor wants. I love it.
Also, brunch food is great. Yeah, right? Yeah. But I mean, I think that speaks again to what we were talking about before, is that sustainability is not just about your carbon footprint. It's about the impact that you have on the community too, right? So a sustainable wedding community is one that supports its local businesses and communities. It leaves a positive impact on the environment and the community. It's not just about your footprint on that one day.
Yeah.
And I think when we're thinking about that sort of systemic change within the industry, it's big. It's hard to imagine, and it's hard to imagine as small vendors too. So where do we start with that?
You're looking at me?
I'm looking at you.
And Trina, as the god of all things in this matter, please impart your wisdom.
Well, I always say to, I coach a lot of businesses, and, when I do the coaching, I always say, just start with what you can. Right? So first, I always say to businesses is just take inventory of what you're doing, because a lot of times businesses don't realize all the good they're actually doing. Right? And so when you start talking to them and you go, you let your employees work from home on Fridays, that's a start, right? And they don't even realize the impact it might have, right? From an environmental standpoint, or so you start just inventorying what it is that you're currently doing, and then start to think about what your business values are, and think about the areas to work on that align to your business values. Because some businesses might be more social and into the community, from maybe food security or affordable housing or something on the social side, or maybe they're more into arts and culture, women's equal employment, or education, or they're on the environmental side, right? So I say just first inventory what you're doing, and celebrate that and be proud. and then start to look at, again, what aligns to your values. And I always say to businesses, at the end of the day, if you're really lost, like it's not simple sometimes, but I always say go back to the 17 goals for the sustainable development goals and look at those if you need like a bit of a framework.
Right. Yeah. Which you can find on the Parkside's website.
Nice plug.
So Natasha, speaking as a wedding planner, if you had one piece of advice for a couple who wants their guests or who themselves want to plan a sustainable destination wedding, what would that one piece of advice be?
I think in a previous episode, we've also honed in on experience, and we've honed in on the fact that a wedding or an event doesn't need to look the same for every person or every couple. So you're choosing that destination or you're choosing that location for a specific reason. So investing in that community, giving back to that community and supporting your local artisans and your local small businesses should really be an easy sell for you, right? Because you're just sharing your favorite things to do in that town or city. So start there and use your wedding website as a source, as a resource for all of your guests, because that's a really good and easy way, tangible way to help make change within your own wedding.
Awesome. That is good advice. Well, and I think it speaks too, like you want to share this experience that becomes part of your story with your guests. And there are so many experiences you can share with them that do connect to that sense of place. And so being able to curate that and tell your story through that, super cool. Trina, can I ask you the same question? If you had one piece of advice for a couple or for a business wanting to do sustainable travel or tourism in their business or at their wedding, what would that be?
Well, at their wedding, I would say, use what naturally comes to that venue or that space. Use the natural assets that it has. Yeah. Right? And that's the thing is like, don't overdo it. Like, don't overthink it. Just keep it simple. Use those natural assets and really use the local businesses in your community. Like really look for, because that's where you're going to get the uniqueness, like you talked about, and you're going to be able to show who you are as an individual, because that's what weddings are about too, is showcasing who you are, right, as a couple, right? So you can have fun with that, right? So that's what I would say. And again, too, for, the business side is to look at their supply chain, because that is the greatest opportunity, is that supply chain, and look to see what you can also source locally.
Awesome. That is great advice. And I think, it's so important to have this. This is kind of an abstract conversation when you think about weddings, but it's so important because, again, travel is such a big part of that footprint. And so thinking about this right at the start of your planning, if you're a couple, but thinking about your whole business, if you are a wedding vendor, is going to be huge. So thank you both for talking about this today. This is such good advice, and I hope that we can see a more regenerative industry in the future.
Yeah, I'm all for that.
Awesome. I don't really know how to end these, so we're just going for that. Yeah.